and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. So President Trump says he's extending the ceasefire with Iran indefinitely, even as plans for a fresh round of peace talks collapse. Now, in just a moment, we'll be joined by Mohit Kumar, chief economist and strategist at Jefferies. We'll also be joined by Bloomberg's John Stepek. But first, let's go to Jumana Barsechi in Dubai. Jumana, what do we know about the ceasefire? Good morning. What do we know about the ceasefire and the status in the Strait?
Yeah, that's right. So much to get through. Developments over the last 24 hours. And of course, yesterday we spent the day anticipating another round of talks in Islamabad that did not come to be. And instead, what we got was a post from President Trump overnight on Truce Social announcing that the ceasefire had been extended. And what we understand is it's an indefinite extension. He has explicitly linked it to Iran submitting a new proposal and discussions are concluded one way or another. But he also said that it came at the request of Pakistani mediators who, of course, have been trying very, very hard to bring the two sides together again. Now, the other important element of that post is he reiterated that the U.S. naval blockade around Iranian ports will stay in place. And if you look at all of the language that has come through from Iranian officials over the last couple of days, they have suggested that the fact that this U.S. naval blockade is continuing is a deal breaker for them in terms of moving to the next round of discussions. In fact, the Iranian foreign minister overnight put up a post saying that blockading Iranian ports is a, quote, act of war and thus a violation of the ceasefire. And so we're in a situation now where both blockades are very much still in place. In fact, this morning, there was some reports of gunfire, gunshots being fired at a vessel that was approaching near an IRGC boat. And then also, it has become a really central point in terms of the sequencing of how we get to the next round of discussions, because the Iranian side maintained that they're not going to enter into talks unless the blockade is lifted. This morning, state media reporting that there have been some signals coming through from the U.S. in the last 24 hours to suggest that they may temporarily lift that naval blockade, nothing being confirmed by the U.S. So again, a state of ambiguity. It's not peace, it's not war, and there's still really, Francine, the possibility that once again we could see another round of hostilities if the two sides are not able to bridge their differences and return back to the negotiating table once again.
Yeah, and then, Jumana, I'm not sure what to make of, what Trump was saying about China, whether they're a friend of a foe at this point, or whether they're helping Iran, which maybe that's how his comments should be interpreted, or whether they're trying to dampen some of, the war.
Yeah, well, I mean, you raise a good point there, Francine. There have been lots of questions as to what China's involvement is in this war. And yesterday, President Trump was doing an interview with CNBC, and he was talking about U.S. restocking munitions. But in the same breath, he went on to say that there was a gift or an unwelcome surprise on one of the Iranian vessels that they had seized, thus making the suggestion that perhaps China had been supplying Iran with lethal munitions. Now, this is an allegation that the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson denied today. They were explicitly asked about it, and they said that China rejects any false association and speculation. But I should also say a couple of weeks ago, CNN also put out a report suggesting that China were looking to help Iran beef up their air defenses. Another allegation that China have denied. Now, what is undeniable is that from an economic standpoint, China continues to buy Iranian oil, so they have supported the Iranian economy to a certain extent. At the same time, a rampant economic instability does not suit their interests. And it was interesting that just a week ago, when the Chinese president was meeting with the Crown Prince of the UAE, they specifically talked about the law of the jungle, and that there's a warning, a threat that the world is returning back to this law of the jungle environment, something which doesn't suit them well at all. And just to add to that, Francine, I would just remind people that China enjoys a good relationship with many of these Gulf states, economically very strong ties. And President Xi did have a call with the Saudi Crown Prince MBS only yesterday, where for the first time they made overt and explicit comments about the Strait of Hormuz, calling for the free passage of vessels. So it is not in their interest for the strait to be closed, disrupted, or monitored by Iran or by any side.
Jumana, thank you. Jumana Bersetchi there with the very latest on the Middle East. Now, President Trump's pick to lead the Federal Reserve has also repeatedly promised to be independent in testimony at his confirmation hearing. Now, appearing before the Senate Banking Committee, Kevin Warsh dodged questions on where he saw rates going. He also said the president has never asked him to commit to a particular rate decision.
Are you going to be the president's human sock puppet?
Senator, absolutely not.
Are you going to be anybody's human sock puppet?
No, I'm honored the president nominated me for the position, and I'll be an independent actor if confirmed as chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Let's get more from Bloomberg's Jill Deesis, who's in Hong Kong. Jill, what are the main takeaway from Kevin Warsh's testimony?
Well, Francine, you heard from Kevin Warsh just there, really that idea of stressing independence, particularly when he was drilled about, any pressure that he may receive from Donald Trump. Obviously, that's really just characterizing the entirety of this nomination process because of how much Trump has continued to attack Jerome Powell in his current position as Fed chair. So you did see that quite a bit. You also had, some of these other ideas for potential changes within the Fed, maybe taking a look at, how frequently or how much detail they publish in certain economic outlook forecasts and in sort of rate path ideas. That's something that he may get a little bit of support from. Actually, there's maybe some suggestion there about frequency of after decision press conferences, that kind of thing. But I do think that this really does come back to this idea that he's trying to stress that he's independent from the president. Although, as we've been discussing, he also did not really give any level of clarity about where he sees rates going. And I think that that's a really key part of this entire process as well.
Jill, thank you so much. Jill Deesis there in Hong Kong. Now joining us with more on this, Mohit Kumar, Chief Economist and Strategist at Jefferies, and Bloomberg's John Stepek, author of the Money Distilled newsletter. So thank you both for joining us. John, it's exciting, right? You hear from Kevin Warsh. He's kind of saying, again, he just has one vote. There are more people, but he seemed to say, he has his own mind. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, if the guy says, are you going to be Trump's sock puppet, he's not going to turn around and say, yes,
I am.
That's what I'm here for. But I think, to be fair, like our colleague John Authors the other day wrote something that I thought was very perceptive on this. And Alan Greenspan at one point was a kind of disciple of Ayn Rand, kind of ultra-libertarian. And he actually turned into arguably the most interventionist Fed chair ever. And set up the kind of template that we've followed since. So I don't think you can really garner an awful lot, from these things. Obviously Trump wouldn't be nominating Warsh if he didn't hope that he was, going to be along those lines. But also the Iran war has tossed everything up anyway, because rates probably would have fallen in both this country and the US if the Iran war hadn't broken out. But of course it has, and that means that it's very hard to make any big calls on rates until, what Jumana was talking about is kind of done and dusted in some way.
Mohit, what do you make of this? Because again, it was my understanding that Kevin Warsh, I guess, had a bias towards cutting, if that's what we could call it, because he looks at it through the AI lens. So that actually changes everything in terms of inflation dynamics and jobs going forward. So again, if it's on the economics, so it's not, the president wants this, I'm going to do it. It's a different dynamic and perspective.
I totally agree. And going back to what John was saying, Trump hoped that he cuts. Yeah. And there, I think this AI lens is very important. Because what does AI do? To me, it's lower employment. People will lose their jobs, one way or the other. Lower inflation, better productivity, and potentially higher growth. So if you look at it from this lens, if you are a previous, I would say, Bernanke or Powell demand-side economics, you would argue growth is better, R-star is higher, let's cut less. But if you are a supply-side economics, which I think Warsh is, you would argue my mandate is employment inflation. We have lower employment, lower inflation. Let's cut more. And then I think one thing you mentioned as well is very important. He's one. He's not the committee. So how do we get consensus? But there I would argue it's still easy to get consensus to take rates to neutral. Right. What neutral is, again, we can debate. But let's say it's...
No one will tell us.
No one knows. But Fed says it's 3.25. So I would say we are maybe 2 rate cuts away from neutral. And I think he would be able to get consensus for 2 rate cuts.
So do you think it's right that actually markets have largely ignored everything that the president has said that could challenge central bank independence, right? I was in Washington last week where he said, well, if, Chair Powell doesn't resign from his post as governor, not as Fed chair, then I could fire him. The markets didn't bat an eyelid.
I don't think it's easy or even sensible to fire Powell, and that's a big blow to credibility of the Fed. And even President Trump knows that a credible Fed is very important. It's very important not just for domestic, but for international investors. So I still feel that the Fed independence will very much stay. That said, we have a chairperson who is leaning towards more cuts. So my base case is more cuts, a bit hawkish on balance sheet, but then the long end of the curve is about what the Treasury does and not what the Fed does. So on balance, I think they will be able to contain rates.
John, what's the market looking at today? So, of course, it's the Strait of Hormuz. Frankly, unclear where we are.
Yeah.
And that's probably the understatement of the year. But then there's also a lot of earnings.
Yeah, I mean, there's earnings today. I mean, I think one thing I think was particularly interesting was Reckitt Benckiser coming out this morning with quite a significant, well, certainly the market's treated as significant kind of miss on like-for-like sales. And I think this kind of goes back to this idea that the market is looking through the Iran war until it starts getting some proof that stuff is happening. And I think this is an issue because, like Reckitt points to, that it's disruption to the Middle East that has hit the like-for-like sales significantly. And clearly the market hadn't priced that in, otherwise the share price wouldn't be down 10% this morning. We saw something very similar. Again, I'm taking a UK focus here, but yesterday a big house builder, Chris Nicholson, issued a kind of shock profit warning, sent the share price down nearly 40%. Again, that was due to interest rate sensitivity, which is kind of exploded since the Iran war broke out. And again, it's something that the market clearly hadn't considered fully. And I think this is why earnings are particularly important just now, because we're going to start seeing the trickle through of these impacts. And that's the point at which we might start getting a read across to other stocks in various sectors and saying, well, who is going to take a hit here? And where have we perhaps underestimated how much of an impact this is going to have? And then I guess in a circular way, that kind of puts more pressure on Trump to find a road out of this, which at the same time then also makes the market more inclined to look through it, because they assume that, well, the tackle is kind of still in place. Like Trump is looking for a kind of exit ramp. I suspect that he'll do his very best to find one, and maybe the blockade will be called off. I don't know if that's the next road forward.
Knows? I have to say your newsletter yesterday was brilliant. Mohit, he called it "Markets are forward-looking but not psychic," which is fair. No, I mean at this time you kind of do have to be a psychic with like Cassandra and the crystal ball.
Yeah, well, the scenario is skewed in so many different directions, and the only option then is to say, well, let's take it as it comes. But unfortunately, that means you can't really rely on the markets themselves to tell you what is going to happen, because they don't know either.
But for the moment, their optimism has largely been rewarded, actually, which has surprised me at times. Do you think, how do you look at this blockade and Iran in terms of energy prices won't go back to what we had in January?
Agreed.
Does that change all the economic dynamics?
So first, the optimism is not just about fundamentals. I would argue it's also about positioning. So if you look at market positioning, 3-4 weeks ago, market was short. Market wanted to rally. All you needed was some semi-good news, not a crystal ball, but some semi-good news, and market was ready for rally. So now S&P is above pre-war levels, which sounds surprising, but I think a lot of it is about positioning. But going back to John's point, eventually we have to factor in how earnings will be impacted because of energy. Oil is not going to go back to 65, 75, 80, anyone's guess, but that's where we see oil, which means we should see changes. We should see differentiations across regions, across sectors. US probably gets much less impacted than Europe does or Asia does. So US should outperform Europe going forward, or people should go back to the tech sector. Or if you think about emerging markets, commodity producers should benefit at the expense of commodity importers. Large companies should do better than small caps because they can do better in an energy price shock scenario. So I do think we will see all these changes.
But when? Because at the moment, again, we're day by day trying to figure out what happens next. But it seems that even in earnings call, people, because they don't have visibility, it's unclear they want to talk about what they do next.
To me, we will see that priced in over the next 3 months. So very short term, we will rally on any headlines. So let's say tomorrow we get a deal, I'm not hoping for, but let's say we do get a deal, market will rally. So that's a beta play. But over the next 3 months, I think investors will focus a lot on differentiation rather than just a long or a short.
John, what else are you focused on? I mean, yesterday we talked a bit about the UK. I know then we had that, Ali Robbins testimony. I don't know, how are things looking in the UK? It seems tough.
No, it is tough. I mean, this morning we got the inflation figures, for example, it's the CPI, and obviously at the start of the year, everyone thought the UK was looking in a good position. It looked as if, interest rates relative to other countries were high. There was space for the Bank of England to cut, and the Bank of England clearly was itching to cut. And before, again, the kind of Iran war, I would have said that, next week's bank decision was a dead cert, quarter-point cut. Absolutely no doubt about it, really, And unfortunately, clearly, that's not going to happen now because, the inflation's not going to go down through the rest of the year. I mean, that is partly because the UK is almost, uniquely vulnerable to these kind of shocks because of poor governance over the last 15 years or so, if not before. Poor energy policy, a lack of accounting for resilience. And so I think that's probably going to continue. As far as the whole drama over the leadership goes, I think it's fair to say that people think of Keir Starmer as a lame duck Prime Minister. They probably have thought that for quite some time. The question is who will replace him, if anyone. And if I'm honest, I think that, again, this is another one of those things the market probably won't price in fully until it sees which way it's going to swing. Particularly because one of the things that I think matters more now is what happens on the Chancellor side of things. Because Rachel Reeves possibly looks less tied to Keir Starmer's fate than perhaps she did a year ago. And, whoever comes in might think, well, we want to keep the markets happy. So even if it's a left-wing leader, they might say, well, let's just keep Reeves for now.
Mohit, your take on the UK? Again, it did feel like it started the year on a high, and actually it's now worse.
If you think, just to put some numbers, so official forecast for the next 3 years for growth is still around 1.3, 1.4. I think we are looking at 0.7 to 0.8 for the next 3 years. So there is a significant difference between what we officially think and what we are likely to get. Which means going to Bank of England, yes, April is not going to happen, very unlikely. But we are all worrying about inflation. We should actually worry about growth as well. UK will suffer on the growth perspective. So I think the Bank of England will still need to cut. Yes, it's cuts delayed, but I still don't see the path where Bank of England cannot afford not to cut.
So interesting. Thank you both for joining us. Mohit Kumar there from Jefferies and Bloomberg's John Stepek. Now, Bloomberg also learns that Anthropic's new and powerful Mythos AI model has been accessed by unauthorized users. More on our scoop next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. Now, Bloomberg has learned that a small group of unauthorized users have accessed Anthropic's new Mythos AI model. Now, to discuss all of this, we're joined by Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst Matt Block. Matt, so good to speak to you. So how did these users, first of all, gain access? And is this a big risk? It feels like a big risk.
Yeah, it is. I mean, so Mythos is this unpublished LLM AI model that Anthropic's developed, which is allegedly so powerful it creates quite a big cybersecurity threat if used maliciously, and it seems like a small group of users have gained access to it. In particular, one of those individuals apparently works for a third-party vendor that does work for Anthropic, so they were kind of had inside information, if you like, in terms of how to get access to it. But they also used a bunch of other kind of more commonly used internet sleuthing tools and access to kind of tools like GitHub, which is a kind of coding repository that lots of coders use. So a bunch of different techniques to get access to it. And as we just said, it is potentially quite serious because right now Anthropic is only limiting access to this new model to a very select group of big companies such as Apple, so that they can use it to test their own systems to identify any vulnerabilities before it gets released to the general public. So it seems like this small group of users are only kind of interested in it from a curiosity perspective, but if there was some malicious intent there, it could have very serious consequences. We've heard recently that financial institutions are very keen to get their hands on this so they can test it on their own systems too. So it could have access implications for the internet at large and maybe even big financial systems. So quite serious.
So, Matt, I mean, on the topic of AI, SpaceX has a kind of agreement to buy, a company called AI Cursor, or it's AI startup called Cursor. What does this tell us?
Yeah, so when we talk about SpaceX, people typically think of rockets, but as part of a corporate restructuring ahead of the IPO, SpaceX acquired Elon Musk's other company, XAI, which is their equivalent of Anthropic or OpenAI. Now, one thing that XAI seems to be weak on is on AI coding tools, and they've been a massive part of kind of the recent surge in popularity of the AI world. And so Cursor is one of a number of small AI startups, well, not that small because it's valued at $60 billion, that is very focused on AI coding tools, and Elon Musk has identified this as a way to plug that gap in the capability weakness that he sees in XAI. So the plan is to, once the SpaceX IPO has happened, to kind of acquire this company or make a big funding round to kind of plug that gap in XAI skills and bring it up to par with some of the big rivals out there.
Okay, Matt, thank you so much. I called it AI Cursor. I'm going to call you AI Matt. We're all going to be AI friends. There you go. Matt Bloxham with the very latest on what's happening in AI. Now, Bloomberg understands that Deutsche Telekom is considering a full combination with its American arm T-Mobile. If approved, the deal would be the largest ever public M&A deal. For more on our scoop, let's bring in our Bloomberg's deals reporter, Manuel Baigorri. Manuel, good morning. So talk us through the potential deal.
Yes, Francine, this would be one of those transformative deals for sure. It's been talked about on and off and on again for years, over a decade for sure. And obviously, it's a deal that makes perfect sense commercially. Deutsche Telekom already owns more than 50% of T-Mobile US, and they've been trying to come up with an idea, a platform that would potentially combine the two, and down the road listed again in the US and in Europe. And obviously, telecom companies have been consolidating, looking for ways to find synergies and to be able to keep up with investments as they roll out new networks. But at the same time, they've been faced with a lot of opposition and regulatory hurdles, and also obviously backlash from politicians. So let's see, still early stages, we understand from our sources, but it will be definitely a fascinating deal in the industry for sure.
What obstacles could the merger face, Manuel?
Yeah, well, definitely we are likely to hear loud and clear from politicians from Berlin to Washington. Obviously, telecoms has always been a very sensitive industry. They employ thousands of people across multiple regions, and obviously also hold very sensitive data and technology, so they are seen as critical companies in their own countries and jurisdictions. So definitely politically it will be perhaps arguably one of the biggest hurdles, then potentially also regulatory hurdles like antitrust as well.
Thank you, Manuel. Bloomberg deals reporter Manuel Baigorri. Coming up, we'll speak to the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development on the Institute's plans to invest in economies affected by conflict in the Middle East. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. U.S. President Donald Trump has indefinitely extended a ceasefire with Iran while maintaining a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz after planned peace talks fell apart. Bloomberg learns that Anthropic's most powerful and potentially dangerous AI model has been accessed by unauthorized people. Plus, Kevin Warsh says he won't be a sock puppet if he's confirmed as the Fed chair, but dodges questions about interest rates. Now, Lufthansa is planning to cut 20,000 short-haul flights from its European summer schedule to save on jet fuel, which has doubled in price since the start of the Iran war. At the same time, TUI has suspended revenue guidance for 2026 due to the war and until conditions stabilize. Well, let's bring in Bloomberg's managing editor for aviation, Benedict Kamel, who's in Berlin. Benny, good morning. So what can we expect in terms of possible further cuts to summer flights?
So, as you said, we've heard from a couple of airlines that are sort of applying cuts across their network and across their cost base. You mentioned Lufthansa. We heard from TUI. We've also heard from airlines like Finnair. We heard from United. We heard from Alaska. So expect that to continue. Essentially, what these airlines are all grappling with is the extortionate price of jet fuel, of kerosene at the moment, which has doubled in the last couple of weeks. And that is something that is really cutting through to their bottom line. United, for example, said that they had $340 million in extra fuel costs in the quarter. So that is something that they need to then absorb elsewhere, and you then see it in areas like cutting back on capacity. Lufthansa is taking out some regional flights, some short-haul flights. They've also already closed down one operation. So that is something that will continue. Very hard look at the cost base. And as a result, for the traveller, that will mean fewer choices going forward because some flights will simply disappear.
So how concerned should European airlines be regarding jet fuel reserves?
So for the time being, there seems to be enough jet fuel available. It's really the cost of the fuel that is the issue, not so much the availability. We did, however, hear from Finnair, for example, this morning saying that if the war persists and if the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz persists, then things could change. For the time being, we have several weeks of visibility. That's what we've heard from multiple airlines. So that is not really the concern. It's not on the availability and on the supply side. It's really the cost side that is wreaking havoc across the industry. But again, we're all sort of at sea at the moment in terms of how this conflict will play out. If things stay this way, it might become more iffy going forward. And even if they do come back, it's not like you can quickly sort of flip a switch and everything's back to normal. You have refineries that are damaged. You have supply chains that are disrupted. So really, people should expect, the industry does expect, that the disruption and, as a result, the elevated prices will remain in place for several months, likely.
Benny, what are the long-term implications then for the industry?
So the industry has to take a hard look at its cost base, and there are several ways to go about that. You can start with things like taking out the capacity, as discussed. You can look at sort of what kind of aircraft you are flying. Are you flying old, fuel-guzzling aircraft? Can those be taken out? And then a slightly more dramatic way to look at it is to say we might need to find a stronger partner. That means consolidation in the industry is once again something that is being discussed. Consolidation always happens during times of crisis, and we are definitely in a state of crisis for the industry at the moment. So we have reported that United has at least sort of casually floated the idea of combining with American Airlines. That particular deal may not happen because of its complexity and size, but that doesn't mean that others can't happen. We've heard, particularly in the US, smaller carriers being in trouble, like Spirit Airlines, which is in bankruptcy and is trying to avoid liquidation. So you should expect some movement in that field. There's not that much left over to consolidate in Europe. There are a couple of sort of fringe airlines, but over in the US, you should expect some more of that to happen, and this is the time to do it.
Benny, thank you so much. Bloomberg's managing editor for aviation, Benny Kamel. Now, our U.S. colleagues will be speaking to Scott Kirby, the United Airlines chief executive, later today. Now, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelenskiy, says repairs have been completed on the Druzhba oil pipeline, allowing the resumption of Russian oil flows to Europe. The restoration of the pipeline marks a breakthrough in Brussels' efforts to release its €90 billion loan to Kyiv. Now, for more, we're joined by Greg Sullivan, Bloomberg's Russia, economy and government editor. So thank you for joining us. Greg, first of all, how crucial is this loan for Ukraine?
It's very important for Ukraine. In fact, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy said that he did talk to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and said that the resumption of the loan should go through. It's a €90 billion loan that has been held up, and it is really crucial for Ukraine. EU ambassadors are set to discuss that today tonight, which is welcome news for Kiev, which after 4 years of war has a war-torn economy. U.S. aid has largely evaporated since Donald Trump came back to office. So they do need this money. They have money right now through June. So to keep fighting the war, this is going to be very essential. It also underlines the importance of the Hungarian election that happened for both Brussels and Kyiv, because it was Prime Minister Viktor Orban who was lead among those holding up this loan.
Greg, at the same time, Russia is ramping up its oil flows. So, is this basically giving Moscow more leverage because there's just not enough oil coming out from the Middle East?
Well, of course, as an oil producer, there is a bit of leverage there. And we have seen that backed up by the fact that the U.S. has given some sanctions exemptions to try and get more barrels to the market. It's also important for Russia. There are obviously a surge in oil prices. They should be reaping a windfall. But these Ukrainian drone attacks on their oil export facilities have really curbed their ability to take advantage of that. So now that they're ramping up, that should help them ease the pressure on their widening budget deficit.
Greg, thank you so much. As always, Greg Sullivan there, Bloomberg Russia Economy and Government editor. Now, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development says it plans to invest 5 billion euros in the Middle East this year. Now, the funds are in direct response to the ongoing conflict in the region and seek to provide both immediate relief and long-term stability. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by the president of the EBRD, Odile Renaud-Basso. Thank you so much, President, for joining us. When you look at 5 billion euros, I mean, it's quite significant for a part of the world that feels oil rich. So what do you see as the main concern longer term?
So I think there is very, very short-term concern for some countries because, for example, the situation in Lebanon or the situation in the West Bank, and the short-term impact of this conflict in the region is very significant through the question of energy prices, oil prices, but also the impact on tourism, on remittances. Countries like Jordan, Egypt are very dependent on tourism, very dependent on remittances from the Gulf. So this has an impact on the whole region. A country like Turkey also a bit further, it is also directly impacted. So our response is designed to be very flexible, address short-term issues, to provide support on liquidity for businesses that are struggling with access to finance, provide support for trade finance, but also longer term to help increasing the strengths of these economies. And for example, a lot of them have potential to develop new energy sources, renewable energy, and this is very important to enhance their competitiveness and resilience over the medium term.
Yeah, and this is almost like, I guess, response to support the financial institutions, with you've mentioned the corporate sector, but also sustainable infrastructure. Will they need more?
Yes, they will probably need more, and they need a different type of support. So we see in that kind of crisis, in the very short term, sometimes you need to move from investing in capex, so in infrastructure or in new capabilities, to supporting liquidity, providing short-term financing, working capital, and so forth. So this, we are ready to do it, and we have the flexibility to do it. But also investment will be needed, and in order to enhance the resilience and the medium-term growth of these countries.
Can the Gulf states help? I was surprised to read first in the Wall Street Journal and then comments from President Trump about the UAE actually asking for some kind of currency swap. Now, I know this is nothing dramatic because it happens all the time, but are you taken aback by the wider region about how this is difficult for them?
Yes, and I think the Gulf countries are very involved in this region and have provided a lot of investment. For example, you remember this big investment in Egypt from Gulf countries. And the question, however, is the Gulf countries are themselves suffering from the situation. So whether they will shift back some investment, reduce it, it's still unclear. I think there have been some signs, but it's still unclear. But I'm sure they will remain very active with their neighbors because the stability of the region is also very important for them.
Odile, when you go to the region and actually speak to the people that you're trying to support, what kind of timeline are they giving you? Because again, it's unclear what happens to the ceasefire or the blockade. At the moment, it's very
Nobody
volatile.
knows. I mean, the situation is so uncertain.
It's so fluid.
So what we are doing is that we are continuing, we're leaning in to continue to invest in this country. When we see a lot of private sector players withdrawing in view of the increased risk, so we are counter-cyclical in that sense that we continue to invest. We signed project recently with Lebanon private sector business in retail, which is something very, relevant for the functioning for people, access to food and functioning of the economy. So we will continue to act and to invest as we were doing and really lean in it to support our clients in these difficult times.
We had a great debrief by, of course, our economy editor for Russia, Greg Sullivan. What's your take on what's happening in Ukraine right now?
I mean, the good news is this, there's a possible disbursement of this 90 billion loan. Of course, the war on Iran has also, in Iran has also an impact on the cost of energy for Ukraine. Any increase of barrel has an impact on trade deficit in Ukraine. So this is not without consequences for the country. But I think this support, continued support from Europe is very important. There were a lot of discussion also on the continuation of the reform agenda, and I think that the country has shown and continues to show its resilience. The big concern is winter preparation, because we've seen last winter very difficult.
I mean, you were in Washington for the IMF World Bank meetings last week. Do you feel like Ukraine really has gone down in the agenda, that people would just worry about it less because of everything that's going on in the Middle East?
I mean, globally, there is a bit of, you see, news are shifting and a lot of focus on Iran. But I still believe, and there were in Washington a lot of dedicated meetings on Ukraine to continue to support Ukraine. A lot of commitment from a number of players, European countries, but also the UK, Canada, Japan. So continue to support. And EBRD, we will continue to be very active in Ukraine.
I also wanted to ask you, we've had two big, elections in Eastern Europe where the EBRD has always been very present, one in Bulgaria and the other one in Hungary. They're just very different outcomes. Does that change your thinking of that part of the world?
I think in Hungary, the election will increase our capacity to step up investment in the country, very likely, because, for example, they will have more access to EU funding. They will probably have a broader, more open framework to finance projects in infrastructure and so forth. So I hope that this will help us to engage more in the country. And in Bulgaria, we are very active. I think the president will. We've been working closely with the Bulgarian when he was a president. I will continue to invest there very actively.
A lot of your systems actually have been more in demand now than they have been in the past. Is that just down to the volatility of the world?
Yes, I think that, and it was very much discussed in Washington, when you have so much uncertainty and, also a reduction of ODA, so less direct financing for development from a number of countries. The role of multilateral development banks are even more important in order to support the countries, to leverage, to provide some support for the government, but also mostly for us in the private sector.
So interesting. Odile, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us. That was Odile Renaud-Basso, the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Now to the big political story in the UK. And the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is preparing for further attacks from opposition parties today after a former top civil servant accused his office of taking a dismissive approach to vetting Peter Mandelson for the U.S. ambassador role. Now joining us now is Bloomberg's James Wilcock. James, thank you for joining us. Brutal 48 hours for Keir Starmer. How damaging has that been for the Prime Minister?
It's always going to be difficult when one of the UK's most senior civil servants says there was an atmosphere of pressure around appointing the former US ambassador. But look, Francine, if you were a deeply unpopular UK Prime Minister, unprecedented in how you've fallen from popularity, if your own MPs were worried about your political judgment, and if journalists around the country were watching for a new contender to rise up, that was all last week anyway. That hasn't changed. And so what we are watching for now is, has the mood turned terminal? And what ministers, MPs, what they're saying to us is, not this week, but look ahead to May, look ahead to local elections, and that's when we start to really sort of wonder if someone would potentially move to replace Keir Starmer.
James, I guess the question is, maybe not this week, because they don't really have a process, right? So they're not as organised to get rid of leaders, maybe like the Tories are, and then it's also unclear who would replace him.
Exactly. And what message would they be? If you're going to change the person at the top who won a historic landslide election victory on a mandate of being different than the Conservatives, what is the message about changing that person going to look like? And when you're in government, you can't really have conversations in public like that. So what we, sort of Bloomberg and all the other journalists are watching and right now is, are there backroom conversations? Yesterday, Andrew Rayner, former Deputy Prime Minister and one of these sort of big leadership candidates, talked about Labour needing to have bolder plans. That's a big flag to watch if you've ever seen one before. Her, Wes Streeting, the current Health Secretary, Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, they're sort of seen as the three to watch. And so if this week or in coming coming weeks, we start hearing more from them. I think that is who people watching Westminster will be paying attention to.
How brutal will the local elections be? And again, is this, almost a referendum on Keir Starmer, or just the policies which have also been a bit, questioned?
I think the reason we're watching these things, look, Ollie Robbins, who is the former head of the Foreign Office, he was talking about an atmosphere of pressure. He talked about questions being made about decision-making in Downing Street. That is all going to damage Keir Starmer. The thing about local elections is, to put it in a business sense, if you're the local branch manager and you have to fire all your staff because the earnings, you knew they were going to be bad, but having to write all those emails when they're sacked, that is what psychologically hurts you. That's what's going to happen to MPs in a few weeks. We're seeing London, the capital, Birmingham, the second largest city alongside Manchester, Wales, these are all Labour strongholds. Polls suggest it could be very, very, very difficult. Now, all Labour MPs know the polls. They're not idiots. But having all the councillors who you've worked with for most of your political career say to you, we're losing our seats, we're losing our funding, we're losing our sort of jobs because of decisions you made in the national government, often that psychological damage is what really pushes people. It's what did for Theresa May. It was the European and local elections back in 2019 that made the Conservatives go, we need to change plans here. And many Labour Party officials and aides privately tell us this is the real moment of danger for Keir Starmer. And what the past 2 days have done is they haven't necessarily changed anything, but they've reminded everyone. They've reminded everyone what the problems are with his sort of Prime Minister, in their eyes, political judgment, issues around process, and ability to convey a message. They've always been there. But this latest sort of twist in the saga, and Prime Minister's questions later today, are likely to put this all back on the agenda right when they want to be talking about cost of living. Yeah, that's never a good thing to be in the spotlight for the wrong reasons just before a local election. James, as always, thank you so much. James Wilcock there with the very latest on the UK PM. Now, coming up, peace talks between the US and Iran have ground to a standstill. We'll get insights from Professor Marc Weller from Cambridge University next. This is Bloomberg. President Trump has indefinitely extended a ceasefire with Iran after planned peace talks between the two sides fell apart. Now, Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency said there is currently no prospect of Iran participating in negotiations. We're joined by Marc Weller, professor at Cambridge University and Global Governance and Security Center Director at Chatham House. So, Professor Weller, thank you for joining us. It's unclear, actually, what happens next. How do you game theory this?
Good morning. Well, first of all, Iran fears that this is just a ruse to cover a surprise attack after midnight, when initially it was thought Mr. Trump's ceasefire would expire. But otherwise, I think this is an invitation by the American president for the Iranian, I think he called it, to put forward an integrated proposal, a full proposal that covers all the demands the United States have made, the nuclear file, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, maybe missile production and support for some of the proxies that Iran has links with, to see whether there's any realistic prospect of coming to an agreement. Unless there isn't a resumption of attacks tonight, I think there's a wider sense that neither the US nor the Iran would profit very much from using force again. For the US, there are no real military targets left they could visit. It would have to be this threat and campaign against bridges and energy installations, which I think some have considered to be a war crime because it deliberately targets civilian installations. The bridges are not used for Iranian military purposes. This is not a land war where they would move massive land forces from one part of the country to another. And for Iran, again, they have discovered that the Strait of Hormuz is another means of widening the conflict horizontally. First, it was the attacks against the Gulf states. Now it is an attack against global trade. All states in the world are affected. And the US then adopted the countermove by having a blockade against Iran, the only vessels that would have been allowed to pass, plus those that pay a fee to Iran. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, the question is, what does a realistic peace deal look like? Because this is not, there are two big things, right? One is nuclear and actually what they have access to. But the second one is who controls the Strait of Hormuz. That's not going to be fleshed out in the next couple of months, or is it?
Well, the Strait of Hormuz issue, of course, is one that only arose because of the conflict. There was no suggestion 6 weeks ago that a state would claim to be able to control global trade through the Strait of Hormuz or charge fees. So that is a negative consequence that has just come about because of the conflict. And one can only hope that the U.S. will insist that this will simply be removed. Iran now seems to see this as a long-term money earner, which would be extremely dangerous for the global regime of the freedom of navigation through straits used for international navigation. There has been the temptation that the U.S. might even join into some sort of traffic arrangement by which they profit, and one can only hope that they entirely reject that. On the nuclear file, the irony is that we can't really end up anywhere that isn't too dissimilar from where we were before the conflict started. The JCPOA, the old nuclear deal, involved the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN, other key players. And it is very difficult to see how you would want to gain control over Iran's nuclear program without an involvement by the International Atomic Agency and others. There are various proposals that could be easily adopted to address the highly enriched uranium that they have. So yes, it could take some time to negotiate, but it's actually not at all impossible to come to an arrangement. But it's difficult for the US because they have to admit that what they end up with is not going to be that different from what they had before.
But Marc, give me a sense of, when you look at some of what tools do they have at their disposal? Like, we understand that, especially for the Iranian regime, this is about survival. How strong is this new regime? What's their real negotiating power?
Well, they have built negotiating power due to the Hormuz issue. They have also opposed the counter-blockade. You saw that the U.S. arrested a vessel a few days ago that was answered this morning by Iran attacking two merchant ships that were near the Strait of Hormuz, and they are pretty desperate to get rid of that blockade, which will threaten their regime in the midterm, because that's their principal or only source of income, their own oil exports and their own connections with the rest of the world. So for them, as you say, it's a matter of survival. They might not mind too much if further bombing imposes further sacrifices on the civilian population. But this blockade, I think, is an issue of some concern to them. And that's why the U.S. has refused to lift it in exchange for Iran lifting its blockage of the Strait of Hormuz.
Professor, very quickly, what role does China play in this? Because, again, that's something that's very unclear at the moment.
Yes, I think China could play a very constructive role. They should really join up with the Pakistanis who are trying to rescue this mediation and offer a guiding hand on the issue of definitely restoring the freedom of the seas through the Straits of Hormuz, transit passage for all international shipping. I think they do have the ear also of President Trump in terms of encouraging moderation on his side. And somehow the grown-ups have to take over and bring the International Atomic Energy Agency and others back into the game.
Marc Weller, thank you for joining us. That was a professor at Cambridge University and Global Governance and Security Center Director at Chatham House. Up next, it's Bloomberg Brief, and this is Bloomberg.